Please, Vince, go on.
I just want to give it a second. Okay, thank you. So I just opened an issue for the conversation we had like last week about cluster class and the managed topologies. If you can open this, like, so just to clarify a little bit of the higher level goals, we are trying to introduce, and as a non-breaking change, and in a 04X release, two new concepts. Well, one CRD and one new managed topology inside of the cluster object. The new CRD will be a cluster, what we call cluster class in here, and it's really like a way to stem clusters of the same shape. And what that means is, like, in practice, is that it's going to be a collection of templating references, like we do for machine deployments and I think machine sets. Yeah. So for example, in here, like if you see on the spec, we have like a little template for the infrastructure. So we have the cluster template. So it could be Azure cluster or AWS cluster, for example. The control plane ref would be, for example, KCP, and that we will need, like, I guess, like, to introduce new templating types. So that's one of the things that we might want to discuss. And so that's like the kind of the first iterations. I don't know yet about the machines. Maybe that's unnecessary because we already have templates, and templates for machine deployments are really just probably like infrastructure and bootstrap references, and those templates are already there. The thing here that was like a little bit interesting, though, is like if we do define the name of a role, then you can reference that name of the role inside of the cluster object and say, like, hey, for this role, I want 10 replicates, and we already know how to reference the role. But again, like, this might be unnecessary. Maybe we can just like do it by convention, and this will be the details of this will be discussed during the proposal. For the cluster object, like today is probably like a maybe very like a little useful. It's used for, I guess, like a bunch of references, and then to kind of group all the resources together. In fact, like every object that is associated with a cluster has labels with the cluster name and has to live in the same namespace. So the idea here is what if we make it a little bit more useful? We have talked about version management, which I'll get into a bit, and we also talked about like managed topologies. So if the cluster can reference a class, and that reference for now, we just make it immutable to not go into all the mutability factors that, like, you know, to change a class, for example. The cluster will know, the cluster controller will know how to create the resources for that cluster. So then we can say like something more simple here. So like, hey, I want a control plane with 3 replicas, and I want this node pools, like set of workers, and then reference those roles. And the idea here is, for example, a lot of companies have administrators that could set these classes up before giving the ability for users to create their own clusters. But then they know how, you know, like that cluster is shaped, and that shape is always going to be the same. In the future, we probably will want to allow the reference templates to be mutable, and then propagate those changes down in the cluster. So then imagine like an administrator wants to push a change, for example, better logging, or update the configuration of like all the worker nodes, etc. We could let folks change that template reference, and then like maybe like draw a plan of actions, like, hey, I want to make these changes, and then apply that plan, and then the changes like will just like go, and we'll use conditions to inform the user when that's done. So that's like the V1.1 idea, but like for the first iteration, it would probably be like immutable, except for like a few values that we want to change. The other super useful thing that's in here, though, it's the version management. Today, to change a version of a cluster, you have to change KCP every machine, and then every machine deployment. And the idea here is that, like, if we do know what's managed in the cluster under this this managed spec, then the version could be propagated first for the control plane, for example, and then the worker node. So we could have also that management. We could also make sure to have rate limiting and not like upgrade blast radius, like everything at the same time. So I talked for a bit. I hope this is like a little bit interesting for folks. It's like really like the first little step to kind of like have like a better user experience.
I
Questions,
see
comments?
Brian with his hand raised.
Hi. Yeah, this feels like a big improvement to me. Thanks. Can you clarify where the reference to the infrastructure specific pieces goes?
That would be in the cluster class. So today, I think like the cluster object, if I remember correctly, has the infrastructure ref that's required. And then there's the control plane ref that's optional, but I think we still want to make that required at some point. So if the class has the template resources for those references, then the cluster controller, when it first reconciles and sees like, oh, I do have a class, but I don't have these resources, it's able to create those resources just by using the baseline of the cluster class.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions, comments, concerns?
I have a question actually. So you mentioned that the cluster control plane ref might be made required later on. Why is that so?
It's just something that we've talked about it. I don't know if we want to do it, but control plane management before Alpha 3 was done by single machines. So not machines in a machine deployment, but actually created 3 different or like n different machines objects, and then making sure that like they were all in a control plane. This has was causing like a lot of issues. Like you can probably think about like upgrades. Like it will be like much harder to actually check that upgrade has been successful. And so we introduced KCP and the concept of a control plane provider. So going forward, we probably want to allow only control plane provider to, but we only talked about it. We're probably not going to make this change for Alpha 4 to create those control plane resources.
Okay.
Sadar?
Yeah, so I had a question around like managing the version of the Kubernetes version in the cluster object itself. So technically, or maybe if my understanding is correct, the way that we do that right now is like the Kubernetes binaries are built into the image themselves, and we just happen to like reference that image when we are like actually creating the machine template or the machine. So like if we just happen to manage or if we just happen to update the version that is specified in the cluster object, how would that version get propagated over to the machine templates, or like that's the part that I'm like unable to wrap my head around.
So usually for image, like finding an image, like the default path, and folks from infrastructure provide like correct me if I'm like way off here. If I remember correctly, like we use the version in there to actually find that image most of the time. Now, like it's true that folks can just say like, hey, I want to use this image directly. So that would be like an unsupported, like this version will not be supported in that case. Like you would have to change the image ID because like we wouldn't be able to like find that probably. But I'll let Cecilia and Yassine go.
Yeah, so actually we were trying to encourage folks to not use that default path. Like the defaulting of the image is really the like reference images that we publish, but they're not, we don't expect most use cases to fall under that category. We expect folks to like build their own images and use those. So I actually asked the exact same question at Cigar in the thread. That's something that I would like us to think about if we go about doing this, because there isn't a good way to like update your image, which is currently very tightly coupled with the Kubernetes version. In my opinion, that's one of the biggest areas for improvement. And that's something we've talked about in other issues as well. I think 3203 had a good thread on that.
You see?
Yeah, plus one to what Cecile said. Regarding the version matching with the machine image matching, we still have a dependency there. Before holding off on the machine bootstrapper proposal, one of the goals at some point, long term or midterm, was that through the CLI / agent that we would embed on the machine side, we would be able to download on the fly Kubernetes components without having to pre-bake them into the machine images. So that might be something we want to explore, whether be it downloading from a public endpoint or a private endpoint if someone is deploying from using air gap, for example.
Okay, are there some more questions with regard to the cluster class and new cluster fields? Okay, seems not. So this is really great. I'm looking forward for this proposal. Let me check if there are another topic in agenda. Joel, up to you.
Hey, yeah, I realize there's not long left, so I'll try and keep this brief. So the experimental operator branch that we've been working on, at the moment, we tried to do a rebase to get it sort of up to date to latest master, and that got merged. And basically, that didn't happen as we quite expected. And now the history is sort of broken. So you've got like some of the old master, and then some of the commits from the experiment, and then some of the new master, and then some of those commits from the experiment again, and it's kind of all mixed up. So at the moment, there's not a clean way to get a merge from that branch back into master, which is what we were hoping to do eventually. So there was a conversation that started in Slack, and I just kind of wanted to highlight this to people who have some ideas about how we can fix this. Alex has actually come up with a branch that would be clean. So he's got a rebase with only the experimental commits cherry picked on top. One of the options is we can try and force push that. Obviously not great. I'm not sure what else like we have in terms of options to clean that up now that it's on the fork. So if anyone has any ideas, I think we're all open to ideas. Yeah.
Could we, I mean, we could probably keep working on this branch for now, but like maybe at the end, when we don't just merge it back, and we just cherry pick those. Is the merging back the concern, or is more like that now by updating the branch, like we're gonna get like in trouble with rebasing?
I think it's a bit of both, because like, yeah, I think the original idea was fine, we'd merge back in, and yeah, we could do like a cherry pick, create a new branch to bring it back in. I don't know if that's going to cause issues with the rebase, not the rebase, the review in that point. I guess we can come to that. I think at the moment, like we can continue working on it, but it's just a bit difficult to work out what the actual conflicts are with master at the moment. So yeah, I'm not fully up to this speed on this actually. Like Alex knows a lot better, but he's not on the call today, so I just wanted to like highlight this conversation, and it's probably best to continue the conversation in the Slack thread.
Mike?
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on what Joel was saying. We had kind of looked at this, myself and Joel and Alex and a few other people at Red Hat, Yeah, we had kind of looked at what was happening with that branch, and there was some sort of weird interleaving of commits that had happened. I tend to agree with Joel, like the new branch that Alex has created, like probably the easiest fix here is if we can agree on it, just to force push that branch, and then it would all be cleaned up. And we'd be able to bring it back to the main branch when we wanted to then. That's all I had to say.
Okay, thank you, Mike. I think that it makes sense to take this offline and see if we can go on with this proposal. So thank you again. If there are no last minute topics, thank you again, Jason, for the demo. Thank you everyone for the interesting discussion, and see you next week.
And thank you, Fabrizio, for being a wonderful host.